Welcome to episode 222 of the Disorganized Wizards Club podcast. My name is Alex. I'm joined as always by my co-host Cam.
Hello, hello.
And returning guest, runner-up of this past weekend's DWC Organizational. We got Matt Hemsley on the show this week. How you doing, Matt?
Hey, I'm doing good.
Good. Glad to have you back on the show after your second place finish this past weekend with Mono Red Aggro. And
you know what's a neat thing about Hemsley being on again? He's been on a few times, and being on for episode 222 means that he's becoming all too familiar.
It's actually a crazy coincidence. He finished second place. It's episode 222. He's becoming too familiar. It's wild how that all lined up. Totally not planned at all, by the way.
I see. Well, I was going to ask why you didn't get the first place guy to come, but now it all lines up, you know?
We had a pretty good conversation with our back-to-back champion on stream. So if anyone wants to catch that post-match interview, they can check it out in the VODs of our Twitch channel. And I'll most likely upload the finals match to our YouTube channel where people will be able to find that there. But yeah, it was an exciting past weekend. Our Cal Time Standard Championship was this past Sunday. We streamed its coverage the entire day on our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Disorganized Wizards Club. And for the first time ever, we had a returning champion. Cam, can you pronounce his name for me so I don't butcher it?
I think it's Nemanja Klajevic, but those J's could be J's and not Y's. I don't know.
Yeah. Returning champion from the organizational number 6 that he took down with Rakdos mid-range. Taking down our event this time around with a deck that I don't think really anyone saw coming, which was mono green aggro. Popular early on in the new format, completely dropped off the map for the past multiple weeks, coming in and just running the tables and taking down everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I played Mono Red like a little bit in preparation, just kind of on ladder. I didn't know that was a deck before I saw it in the finals. So, you know.
Yeah, I hadn't seen it anywhere. It wasn't really on any of these aggregation pages. It wasn't any of these stat breakdowns. Like, I think the previous mono green deck that was around was like the food, Feasting Troll King, Wicked Wolf type deck. And this was not that. This was just, gem razors on creatures, attacking, some Garrick's main, going fast.
Yeah. Actually, got pretty lucky with his draw in the top 8 bracket too, being on the part of the bracket with two mono red decks and Sultai. So he was able to get pretty lucky and beat the Sultai matchup in the corners, and then got to ride mono red all the way to the title, which is a pretty fantastic matchup for the mono green deck, which we discovered pretty quickly after watching him run through everyone. But yeah, it was a great day. We had, I guess, a less diverse top 8 than I expected. There was a lot of mono red aggro. We had 3 copies. We had 2 Naya decks, although they were different versions of Naya. We had one Naya Toski deck featuring Clarion Spirit, one Naya Runes deck, which is another deck that I don't think was on anyone's radar either. They had a really great Swiss portion of the tournament. That was super exciting to see. Then we had our mono green, one Sultai Ultimatum deck, and one mono white deck.
Yeah, that Naya Runes deck was something cool. I mean, I got smashed by it actually in the Swiss, and I ended up beating it in the top 8. But yeah, that one was pretty cool. I like that one.
Do you think it's a good matchup? Like, what differed between the Swiss and the top 8?
I drew pretty well in the top 8. I think with the mono red deck, if you can draw Embercleave, that's sort of the difference.
Yeah, fair enough. You're basically playing Boggles yourself then.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's what I was saying is, Annex plus Embercleave is just Splinter Twin and Standard, So when you draw Splinter Twin, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, for anyone who isn't familiar, when we say Naya Runes, which I don't fault you if you're not, it was playing things like Transcendent Envoy to discount enchantments, playing Setessan Champion to draw and get huge off enchantments, and Runeforge Champion to fetch runes. And if you have Runeforge and Transcendent Envoy in play, you can cast your runes for free, actually. So you can just, loop a bunch of them if you keep drawing them. And then other enchantments and protection spells were around. Basically just a Boggles deck with a bunch of card draw in it from Setessan Champion and Showdown of the Scalds. Just making a huge thing and killing people.
Yeah, he was also playing a couple copies of Storm Herald, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Storm's Herald was a sweet one because if a bunch of runes end up in your graveyard, if your creature somehow gets dealt with, that thing could just kill somebody out of nowhere, bringing them all back. And even if they don't die, it's like a draw spell. All those runes it reanimates, draw a card.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
And of course, this is a 4 Showdown of the Skulls deck as well, which plays perfectly into this kind of game plan here. And yeah, the deck was really impressive. I think looking at their record through the event, they played against a pretty wide variety of decks. They played against Rakdos, just 4-color cycling, mono red, mono green, Gruul Adventures, mono white. Able to crush everybody. I don't think they lost in the Swiss aside from when they played against our champion on mono green angle. That was their only loss in the Swiss portion.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely a pretty good run for them. The only player in our field that played Naya runes, making a push all the way to the top 4 of the event. Definitely a really exciting event, exciting deck there. But yeah, aside from that, I think what surprised me most about the metagame at our event this past weekend was how prevalent mono red was. It was coming off an incredibly tough weekend the weekend before, where it felt like everybody was packing so much hate for it, and it got absolutely crushed across all events. And then comes back this weekend, still one of the top 4 most played decks in the entire metagame across all tournaments, and rocks over a 50% win rate and puts 3 copies into our top 8. So what do you guys think happened here? Why was mono red still so popular, and how did it manage to find such success after being absolutely crushed just 1 week ago?
Yeah, you go ahead, Matt, since you're the one who chose to play it. You can walk us through your answer and both your thought process for picking mono red.
So, I mean, I guess it kind of goes towards the topic that we kind of decided to go through this week, which is how to practice for tournaments with unlimited time, and how it is very important to kind of pick an archetype quickly. I don't know. I've just been playing mono red kind of on ladder. I knew it out pretty well. It has ways to win in various matchups. I mean, most of it is drawing Embercleave or whatever. But I think it's a deck that rewards skill expression. It has skill expression, right? It really rewards correct sequencing. I think it's relatively difficult to play correctly, in the sense that to really grind out those last few points of the last few percentage points. It's tough, and there's decisions to make, so that's fun. But it's also an arena tournament, and I have very few wild cards, so I just have to jam some mono red. I wish I had some I knew it was going to be good because I read the tea leaves, and I just figured it out. But it's I don't really play very much on arena, but I wanted to play the tournament, so mono red.
So would it have been, if you had unlimited access to a stocked arena account, would it have been your choice, or would you have picked something else?
I mean, I still think it would have been my choice, but I was sort of locked into that decision, right? Because I don't know, I feel like I really like the Sultai matchup. I really like the Dimir matchup. Any sort of Temur ramp deck. I'm just going through the standard metagame right now. I think mono white is a somewhat challenging matchup, but comes down to most of the time who is the better player. I feel like there's a lot of skill expression there. Decks playing Lovestruck Beast, I think, are by far the hardest. But you certainly have ways around Lovestruck Beast, either through the air with an Embercleave or something like this, or a Torbrand being successful and sticking around, something like this. I think it's a pretty reasonable deck choice.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that Lovestruck Beast decks are a hard matchup for it, and that was actually what was most prevalent at our tournament. With Naya decks, Naya variants, I guess the Runes deck doesn't count, but it was only one. So Naya variants, almost all of them playing Lovestruck Beasts, were 13% of our meta. 9% was Temur decks, the Adventures also playing Lovestruck Beast. So that's a good quarter, close to a quarter of our field had Lovestruck Beasts in it, and yet mono red decks did well. Yeah, as we mentioned, putting 3 into top 8. So maybe they just didn't draw the Lovestruck Beast as much, or did you change your sideboard much to adapt for that weakness, or is that something Red's been doing for a while?
Yeah, I mean, you play like the Akroan War and you play the Soul Seers are pretty common. But I mean, even if they like land Lovestruck Beast, it's one of those situations where if they don't actually draw the Lovestruck Beast, then I think the matchup's like quite easy. Right, but if they do have one or multiple of the 5/5s, you kind of have to find a way to push damage through. But even if you push damage through, even if you have to find a way to push damage through, the deck's usually pretty good at that. Especially if you try lines which try to like minimize the amount of 1/1s they have available. So like they're just 5/5 walls, while you kind of stall out for a way through the air, or to build up a big enough board state, or find a Torbrand, or find an Embercleave or something like this to kind of go around. But one of the defining things about the mono red deck I find is that, obviously there are games where it just wins by, turn 3 by putting, multiple Fervent Champions, or like Robber plus other 1-drops into play. But the addition of Faceless Haven really gives it a lot of like kind of staying power, and kind of turns it into being able to play a mid-range role quite well.
Yeah, that is true. It's your point about it like having some free wins with a bunch of fervents and stuff. I guess the mono white deck can have fast starts like that as well. Something like Maul of the Skyclaves on Seasoned Hollowblade is comparable, but all these Naya variants are looking to like set up to use a showdown, or they're casting like the adventure halves of their creatures first, which are, not quick. Like you're planning to get card advantage off these things, cast them later, turn 4, turn 5. Sultai and Team are obviously slow as well. Cycling has to cycle a bunch before it's good. It's quick, but it's not like as fast as those starts you've mentioned. So it is kind of the one deck that has these draws that are almost free wins.
Yeah, so when you compare like the fact that it has a lot of free wins, either through, low to the ground starts, or by just randomly having Embercleave plus Annex, and you kind of combine that with the consistency that you get from a monocolored deck, with the addition of, plus like you have Manlands, which like Faithless Haven is like a busted card. I played it in both the events I played this weekend. I've also played one of the Mox events in Pioneer. It did pretty well, just playing mono black with Faceless Haven. The ability to switch between this sort of like really fast paced aggro deck and then the more mid-rangey sort of thing, makes it pretty powerful. And it gives it the ability to beat cards like Lovestruck Beast, even though obviously Lovestruck Beast is like not what you want to see. If you can find a way to manage those, which isn't all that hard, if you like kind of stretch the game out a little bit, the combination of like Lovestruck Beast plus Great Henge plus other stuff, then okay, maybe it's difficult, but yeah. Embercleave is busted. So
So with as much as you're sort of hyping this deck up and explaining how it has play against these problem cards, have you been paying attention to coverage? Like, do you have any ideas what went wrong last weekend that made us think mono red was on a downswing or just not very well positioned?
Honestly, no.
You think they just got unlucky?
Honestly, no. I've been playing a lot less Magic recently, and also been like watching a lot less. I've been still enjoying playing tournament Magic, but I don't have a combination of like not having as much time as I used to have. I don't know if that's just getting older and having my time be more valuable, or having more responsibilities, or just like realizing that you actually just have a finite amount of time. I don't know which one.
Well, maybe the people who make years are just putting less time in them. Just like with chocolate bars, they're charging the same for smaller chocolate bars,
Yeah, so when you're like Jim Morrison, you die when you're 23, that was just a fun size.
It's shrinkflation.
Yeah. That's pretty good. I don't know. I just been playing mono red on ladder. I didn't know it had a bad week last week, to be honest. I just been playing it on ladder sometimes. I didn't want to.
The blissful state of mind of a mono red player.
Just grind ladder games, because I don't want to grind control. But I just been playing. It's been doing well for me on ladder. I feel like I understood it. I didn't want to like learn standard and like learn the entire format, kind of just to play in a couple tournaments. So just I understand the deck pretty well. What has to happen for it to win, what has to go wrong for it to lose. So I figured, that's just the one.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right. So Another deck that had a pretty fantastic weekend last weekend was Sultai Ultimatum. One copy of the deck made into our top 8 after starting 6-0 in the Swiss before losing in the final round, taking its first loss, and then eventually losing in the quarterfinals to our eventual champion. Sultai Ultimatum coming off a pretty solid weekend the previous, and I think this deck it was getting really good, and then people figured out ways to fight it, and the mono red and mono white decks popped up to fight it, and then the deck kind of got smashed, and then it came back last weekend in small numbers and did particularly well in the MPL and Rivals weekend, and then has returned this past weekend as the most played deck across all events on MTG Melee, rocking 53.2% win rate, which is the second highest amongst all of the other decks in the field, and is by far the most played by more than 100 copies in all these events. So
those are just the XD copies you have to play to get access to Yorion.
So Sultai Ultimatum making a pretty good case that it's here to stay, and might be the best deck in the format. What are your guys' thoughts on Sultai? Matt, I don't know if you played against it at all in the event or have any opinions on this deck, but to me, it's looking like this deck is not going to go anywhere, and I think we might have the best deck in our format on our hands now.
I don't know, maybe. I always kind of just smash it on red. Is that not the sentiment? Like, I don't know. Like, you kind of just play cards and they die. The only time I played it in the DWC tournament was against LP in the second last round or something like this, when we were both X1. I mulled to 5 game 1, so I lost that one very barely. You streamed this one, actually, I think. But then I won games 2 and 3 quite easily. I don't know. It just seems like they have a hard time dealing with any sort of like fast draw. So I don't know how much open deck lists play into that. If you're just like, if you can't keep hands with like Goldspan Dragon and like Thorbrand in them, then maybe it gets worse.
Yeah, that definitely benefits the red deck.
Yeah. Taking a look at the win rate matrix here, Sultai had a 44.7 win percentage against mono red. So your idea of the matchup definitely plays out by the data. 40% against cycling and 42% versus Dimir Rogues, which I think everyone would agree that seems pretty obvious that the Rogues deck would have a good matchup against Sultai Ultimatum.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like this Ultimatum deck. Like, it's kind of found its home now. And I mean, by its home, I mean like the lists seem to be sort of settling down. It's found that it can include like 2 Essica's Chariots for a little bit of extra staying power on the battlefield. It sort of still has this huge over-the-top ultimatums. I don't know. I'm just a sucker for control decks, and I think it's the closest we have. And I guess I'm not a sucker for ramp decks. I don't generally like ramp decks, but if you're ramping into control cards, maybe. I don't know. I like the play patterns. It's a fun deck. You wrath your opponent, you cast something huge, and it's the type of deck that, like, I've seen lists that are playing like only 2 Extinction Event, 2 Shadows Verdict. It's very easy to include more copies of those cards and more spot removal if you need to worry about, the aggressive decks. The one that was in our top 8, I think, had found room for 2 Behold the Multiverse. That's a very easy card to cut if you need more interaction. And yes, while there's 80 cards and it sort of somewhat reduces your consistency, it's consistent. Let me not stutter that sentence. The fact that it continues to do well means that, just as we've seen in the past, things like Omen of the Sea gives the deck enough consistency in its gameplay that these small tweaks probably will affect its matchups enough. And yeah, like 44 against red's not great, but it's not that south of 50. And if you change it to be a bit more hateful, you could be good. Like, that's typically what we see in control decks, right? Like, the power of a control deck lags by about a week as its answers adapt to how the format is changing, and then it'll have a good weekend when the format settles.
Yeah, maybe the thing about the Sultai Ultimatum deck that strikes me kind of when I look at the list is it's almost like analogous to, do you remember like the green-black deck that was playing like Carnage Tyrant from Ravnica Standard? It had like
Kind of.
it had the Explorer creatures and then like the Wild Growth Walker.
Yeah.
So if you remember in that standard, that was like the kind of quote unquote best deck, but it wasn't winning that many tournaments because while it had the tools to deal with every other deck in the format, it didn't really have space to deal with all of them at the same time, right? You had like the Arclight Phoenix deck, and you had like more lower to the ground aggressive decks as well as control decks, and it kind of felt like you could tech against like two of those, but they're all kind of pulling you in different directions. So
That makes sense, yeah.
you know,
This multi-ultimatum is under a similar tug.
yeah, so like, you can include fewer draw spells, you can have more interaction, and that's going to help maybe against red, but then it makes you worse against
Yeah, you get outcarded by something playing Showdown of the Scalds or
yeah, exactly. So I don't know, that's just kind of my impression when you say things like this, right? Where okay, well, it has not a great red matchup and you can make it more hateful towards red, but then you're cutting all these draw spells and things.
Yeah, I mean that's just what I think I was getting at. Like the power of Ultimatum, I feel like, is going to be a step behind as it sort of catches up how it's teching itself to what it expects the meta to be. And the weekends where it hits, it's going to look like it does well. And the weekends where it misses, like when Mono Red picked up in popularity suddenly, it's going to look bad.
Right, yeah.
All right. Well, before we transition to our topic for today, let's talk about the best performing deck from this past weekend, which is Cycling Pyromancer. Now, Cam and I, we talked about Jeskai and 4-color cycling on last week's episode. And I remember saying that I thought this deck had probably one more really good weekend in it before people start paying it the respect it deserves. And what do you know? 55.6% win rate, positive matchups across every deck in the format, outside of Teamer Adventures, where it was rocking 49.6% win rate, which I don't know about you guys, but that's pretty close to 50-50 to me. So this deck running the tables. It didn't put any copies into the top 8 of our event, although it did finish 9th and it did finish 12th, both at X and 2, missing out on top 8 on breakers. So virtual top 8s there. The deck looked really good when we saw it on coverage, and it was smashing in other events. Are people finally going to start packing enough hate for this deck? Yes or no? What do we think?
It feels like such a meme deck still. Like it feels like it should be fragile and that it shouldn't be as good as it is. So people might trick themselves into not respecting it still, because it actually takes quite a bit to like really respect cycling. Like you could think you could just go after the graveyard, and we've seen people doing that with extra scavenging oozes and stuff. But the inclusion of the pyromancers, and even like in some games we saw in Versus yesterday, Valiant Rescuers can pop off, Flourishing Fox can pop off. Like they don't need their graveyard if you devote too much to answering it. So you really need like some graveyard interaction and a cheap sweeper, ideally one that exiles, maybe something like Crush the Weak. And asking people to commit 2 different types of sideboard cards to a deck that feels like a meme, I don't know. Maybe they'll do it, but maybe it's got another weekend in it.
I mean, let me tell you, when I was playing Scales at the beginning, a lot of people wrote that one off as a meme deck and didn't really care to learn about it or do anything like this, right? So I respect the power of meme decks or supposed meme decks, and I think cycling's actually pretty good. So when Stelly said, are we going to see more hate getting packed for it? I mean, is it the graveyard? Do you just like turn off the Zenith flares? Is that what the hate?
You have to do both. You have to turn off the graveyard,
right?
But they can also like just go wide, making a bunch of 1/1s or making like a big Flourishing Fox. So you also need to have like a sweeper to stop the aggro plan.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, so yeah, I know that's what you said. I just meant like, what is that like the general consensus? Like right now, if you ask like 100 standard players, like if you had to pick like one hate card for cycling, is it just like?
If you had to pick one, I think you go after the Zenith flares, because otherwise, in playing the game to stop them from killing you on the board, you just die because all their cycling cards end up in the bin.
Yeah, because like they do attack you on like multiple axes.
Yeah,
it's not even just
that's the thing. It's kind of hard to account for all of their game plans. But what I've found from playing against the deck is that if you don't have to worry about that Zenith flare, everything else is a lot easier to manage. But that just impending Zenith flare off the top of the deck that's just going to hit you from 20 to 0 is always there. Those matches are a lot harder to win.
Yeah,
right. Okay. So
turning off the Zenith flares does give them dead draws. Like some of the games we watched Cycling lose was because they had 2 Zenith Flares in hand, each of which would do like 2 damage. And so they've basically, forced mulliganed and had nothing going on.
I see.
But like
So
previous
I was gonna
versions
say,
of this deck were a lot more susceptible to the graveyard hate because they were all Lurrus versions of the deck, right? Like until Call Time, this deck was a Lurrus deck. But now they're building the deck with the 4 copies of Ironcrag Pyromancer in their main. So yeah, their game plan isn't as susceptible to just graveyard hate. And I don't know. Yeah, like Cam said, a lot of different things you have to account for, but I do feel like their creature game plan is a lot less frightening without its graveyard. So
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I guess I was gonna say like, it takes away like the need to clock them, I guess, because if you don't have the Zenith Flare weighing over your head, you can kind of take your time and deal with the board, kind of piece by piece, and then establish your own game plan. Whereas if the Zenith Flare is live, you have to be kind of attacking. But then like they have maybe a Flourishing Fox that's like pretty big. It makes it difficult to attack. Stuff like this, I guess.
Yeah, you definitely asks a lot more of you to race them drawing a Zenith Flare.
Yeah.
What though? Like, why Kaldheim Standard to build the deck this way? They're not playing any new cards.
yeah, the only new cards this deck is playing are 4 copies of Hengegate Pathway. That's it. Everything else has
Which
been
is
in the
not
format.
a major addition.
Yeah, like
So
nothing else is new. We've just decided to build the deck differently. And maybe it was just realizing that if you relied less on your graveyard, the extra access that a card like Ironcrag Pyromancer gives you has led to more success. And I mean, we've seen that play out. I mean, the deck's performing way better than it ever has before.
was there a ban in between when it was bad and when we're building it now? Would that have impacted anything?
There wasn't a card that was played in the deck that was banned.
But I mean, like a card that it had trouble with that's not in the format anymore. Nothing rotated. None of the bans.
Well, I'm thinking on the same line as Cam. Is one of the reasons why it's successful now is that there's not like an actual control deck in the format.
Yeah, like Uro doesn't exist anymore.
It could be that they just struggled with Uro, like
Rogues isn't really popular.
letting you ramp to race them. Like the 3 life does pad you against Zenith Flare. I don't know.
Well, in the last standard, I was playing around a little bit with like the blue-black control that was playing like simulacrums and like you'd just have like Ugins and stuff and like Shark Typhoons. And I feel like if you try to play like cycling into that, then that's not going to be good for you. But there's no real control deck. Like the only thing is there's nobody really trying to interact so much with your side of the board. The closest, I guess, is Sultai. But even then, it's kind of ramping to Ultimatum.
Yeah, I guess the deck you were just describing, like a close to actual control or, a standard control blue-black deck is going to have enough sweepers and counterspells main that they can turn off the board and then protect against Zenith Flare. Like, countering it also works. You don't have to go after the graveyard. And so, there isn't really something like that with those effects pre-board in the format. Sultai doesn't play that many counterspells.
Yeah.
Not enough to have them consistently.
That deck existed in the first couple weeks of this format when it was the blue-black control deck that was splashing, binding the old gods. But that deck just got outpaced by the Sultai Ultimatum deck. And and the Ultimatum deck just filled that deck spot in the metagame now. So,
well, yeah, even like, those control decks, you got to have them be good in like against like the mid-range decks, right? But if you resolve like the Scald, you just win immediately, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Blue Black Control are going to struggle with Showdown.
Yeah, like just the way the cards are made, you can't have like Drago Control so much anymore because if you let one thing through the crack, every single card that you just let through is going to draw you like 4 or 5 cards.
I mean, it's not even Showdown to the Scald that's that bad. Like if you don't counter the turn 1 Edgewall Innkeeper, you're dead.
Yeah, if you don't, exactly. So you have the Edgewall Innkeeper, you have the Showdown, you have Feldar Retreat. These are all cards that like Drago Control, just like if they resolve, you're dead.
Yeah, all these cards gain more card advantage than any card the control deck have.
Yeah, like that was the thing is like you could never beat the Great Henge either when you played that deck. You just like had to hope you could remove it, right? But or like, sorry, that you could counter it, or you could remove the creatures to keep them off it, or something like this, right? So like all these like crazy mid-range enchantments just outvalue the control decks. This doesn't exist anymore. So decks
make card draw blue again, please.
Please, yeah.
No, card draw is part of Green's color pie now, Cam.
It's
color
a
identity
Naya
has
effect.
changed.
That's
Blue just gets to tap creatures for an extra turn now. That's it. And give stuff flying.
Wonderful.
It's allowed to give stuff
I
flying
really like
it. Take an extra turn every so often. That's all you get.
That's yeah. That's before we go into like the actual topic this week. Did you guys? I meant to bring this up when we were talking about my tournament, but did you want to talk about the hand because that I kept, and then like the card I put back?
We can talk about this because Cam and I had a bit of a disagreement of what we would have done, but
yeah. So when I was getting smashed because I put back a land and then draw the third land, I thought a lot about this and I decided I would have done it differently. But I came to a different conclusion actually than what you guys are talking about.
Okay.
So what was the initial? So this was a Malta 6 that you kept, and what were the 7 cards you were looking at?
So yeah, it was a Malta 6 I kept on the play against mono green. And the hand was 3 lands, 2 just snow mountains, and then a castle Embereth, a fervent champion, a robber the rich, a annex, and an embercleave.
Was it the other one?
No, it was definitely the Fireblade Charger.
Yeah, Fireblade Charger. Yeah.
Oh, what did I say? Did I say fervent champion?
You said fervent champion. Yeah, it was the one that pings when it dies. Fireblade Charger. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It was the Charger. And I elected, after thinking about it for a bit, to put a land back. And if I could do it again, I would put the Charger back 100%. I think the Charger back is correct.
That makes sense. So while we were doing coverage, I thought the Embercleave should go back, and Stelly agreed with you putting a land back. My thinking was that curving 1, 2, 3, and then hoping to draw some other payoff, either another Embercleave or a Torbrand or a dragon or something, or like lands to activate the castle. Just that guaranteed good start was more worth it. What was your reasoning at the time for putting a land back?
So for me, getting rid of either Annex or Embercleave was completely out of the question, because though that's the combination you need to win this matchup, right? This is the mono green deck that's playing, Lovestruck Beast as well as all these other just beefy stat sticks, right? The only way you're powering through, is really with the Embercleave. And I think I actually went back and I watched some of the other coverage of the semis, the semis where he played a mono red opponent as well. And the only game the mono red player won, he won purely on the back of Embercleave, right? So, I mean, that's really the only way you can win this matchup. But it's also like pretty difficult for them to beat, the double striking 7 power Annex or whatever. Then when it dies, it gives you multiple tokens as well, right? So like Annex plus Embercleave, literally Spinner Twin. The reason to play the deck, we have it in our opening hand. We're not getting rid of it.
That makes sense.
Then the Robber is better than the Charger. So my justification for putting back the land was this deck, it's not like your typical mono red deck. It's 25 lands. So we have, 22 of them available to draw because we have 3 and we're putting 1 back. The odds of drawing 1 in your first 2 are pretty high. They're not quite 70%, but they're it's around 66. At the time, I just kind of back of the envelope did about 70 because you have 54 or 53 cards and there's 22 hits, right? So it's about 70%. And I figured that was pretty good. And then I figured you also win some percentage of games that you miss for a turn. But you're pretty likely to hit. And if you do that 1, 2, 3, you're just pretty much winning. If you get to go 1, 2, 3 and then Embercleave, then you're pretty much winning every single game. They don't really have an answer to that. So I decided to take that risk, and it didn't pay off because I just whiffed on the land.
Yeah, I definitely understand the thinking that like play a bit risky. If you do hit the third land, then obviously your curve is insane. I guess I just underestimated the importance of that combo of Annex Cleave in the matchup, and so I didn't think the risk was worth it. But if the risk is necessary, then I understand your decision.
Right, but it also, the other element and the other level to this is that if you throw back one of the creatures, you have to draw land anyway to hit the Embercleave, or you have to draw something else you can play, right? So my thinking was me throwing back the 1/1 when the 1/1 ramps to the Embercleave was just, somewhat self-defeating.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So that was my decision process at the time. However, I think if I could go back and do it again, I think I just give myself a better chance of like actually getting to play the game. And even if it comes down a turn late or even 2 turns late, just the annex cleave, getting the annex into play.
And it does feel like if you're looking for something to discount the cleave, like if you keep the 3 lands, you can cast your creatures. And if you're looking for something to help cast the cleave, don't you have more creatures to draw to than lands?
Yeah, and I agree. Which is why I think putting the Charger back is correct. But at the time, I was like, well, the Charger is basically a land for the cleave anyway, and we want to just 1/2/3 it. So and we're likely to 1/2/3 it in the sense that we're more likely to draw a land in the first 2 than not. So that was the decision-making process. But I'm pumped that Sally agrees with me that you gotta risk it for the biscuit.
My immediate, like, there was never any doubt in my mind that I would have put a land back. And Cam tried to level me out, and I was like, hell no, I'm greedy as hell. I'm putting that land back. We're curving out.
Yeah. You know what? Nothing but respect for it, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was so stoked when you put it back. I was like, let's go.
I didn't get to the finals because I'm playing well. I got to the finals because I am drawn hot.
Yeah, honestly, I did not consider putting back the Charger, but after you've explained it, I definitely think I like that play more than putting the land back. But it honestly, in the moment, it was not something I even considered.
Yeah, that was the thought process. That was what I was tanking on there, and I just said, screw it, I'm just gonna draw it. And,
this is, I think, why I miss some percentage points when I play aggro, because like I usually play slower control decks, mid-range decks, and so like all my instinctual responses are like, make sure that you can play the game for longer when you'll have your powerful cards, and that like knee-jerk response isn't good in aggro, and I can't get rid of it.
Yeah, so there was also there's a lot of people who are like hardwired that way, and it does influence how you play decks and like what decks you're going to be good with. Because I'm thinking of a situation in Legacy when I was in a call with a bunch of people and I was playing Delver. And the other person was like, this is, they're kind of an established, mid-range Legacy player. And I had a situation where I had a Delver on the play. My opponent played a land and swords it. And I had the opportunity to either daze or force the swords, but I have a Tarmogoyf in my hand in the second land. And I just forced when I could have dazed. And this, completely befuddled the Miracles player who always plays the mid-range value decks.
Yeah,
and it was just the logic there being is you slam Tarmogoyf, and then because there's so much pressure with Goyf plus Delver that the daze is going to be good eventually.
Yeah, so being down a card off the force doesn't matter as much because you've got this pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so it's like, the daze is going to be good eventually because it has to be, because you have pressure and, you're throwing. So the fact that you throwing away a card and throwing away the more powerful spell, arguably, in the sense that it can counter more stuff. And there's no restriction on it. Kind of flabbergasted. But then we went on to win very easily because we had a daze and we dazed, I don't know, something good. But yeah, so that's the type of thing that it's also just the benefit of discussing things with friends, which is I think part of what we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, well, that's this whole podcast, right? We're just discussing things with friends.
Yeah, exactly.
I think now's as good a time as any to transition to our topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so since you had mentioned here while we were talking that you don't have as much time to be playing the volume of Magic that you used to, or maybe not as much interest, a combination of the two, and yet you still enjoy tournament Magic, that means that you now have to prepare and pick decks, and I was going to use the word prepare again. Yeah, you now have to prepare for tournaments without just sort of brute forcing your way into an understanding of formats. So this topic that you wanted to discuss was your technique and your process for learning a new format that you're going to play a tournament in, picking a deck in it, and just generally becoming prepared for such events.
Yeah, because I think back especially when I was in undergrad, the way I would learn a format, and I would consider this one of my strengths as a player, is picking a deck that's good for a particular meta. But before I just had the time and kind of the freedom to just sort of pick a deck I think was good and then just grind. So yeah, before I would just grind and just eventually figure out what's good, just kind of through trial and error, and obviously just making like some sort of, guess at what was good, some hypothesis, and then testing it. But like mostly, I play like hundreds of matches, play like lots of leagues and stuff. But now, a combination of like, we're both in our like last year's like, PhD stuff. So, I mean, that's, a lot of work involved there. But also, I've really disliked a lot of the changes they've made to Magic in like 2020 and 2021, both in like terms of like organized play and just like the way games play out and card design and stuff. So I still really, really love the feeling of playing competitive Magic and like playing tournaments and like, discussing how to improve with friends and stuff. But I just don't enjoy the game enough to constantly be playing games that don't really matter just to like learn an understanding of the format.
Yeah. And I mean, this is actually probably a very reasonable take because I feel like Magic is a hobby that people devote so much time to, and it just starts to feel normal when like most other hobbies are like a few hours a week.
Yeah, for sure. Like before, like sometimes I would play like, there were times where I'd be playing like multiple leagues a day, and like leagues can sometimes take like an hour and a half, right? So, I've, had points in my life where I've been playing like Magic 3 to 4 hours a day, and it just like kind of cringe when I think about like all the other stuff I could have been doing.
You know those people who say like, I've watched every episode of The Office 3 times. You can probably very easily see how many hours that is and compare it to how many hours we spent playing Magic and just blow them out of the water.
What about people like me who've watched every episode of The Office 3 times and also played Magic? I'm just screwed.
Well, was it simultaneous?
Wasted my life.
Did you have it running in while you were playing leagues?
Yeah, maybe. That's double counting. That's but yeah, it's I think there's a lot of value to kind of like understand that your time is finite and it's not a limited resource. Shout out to that podcast. I didn't mean to do that, but yeah, time is the true limited resource.
Yeah, pretty deep, man.
Wow. Yeah, 14 of this is deep.
All right,
but
yeah, when you're playing and you don't have masses of games to fall back on, you have some few number that you can play. One thing you point out here to really make sure that you're doing is to play with a competitive mindset, not this sort of mass testing mindset. Like, be aware that you only have a few games, and so don't keep hands you wouldn't keep during a tournament just because whatever it might turn out.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, like the overarching theme there is that like making sure that every decision that you make and that every whether it's like hands you keep or cards you want to try out or lines you take, is you need to be like learning something, right? You can't just like do this because like heuristically you think it's good and it'll probably win you the match, right? I think there's a lot of value in even taking lines that you think are worse just to find out that maybe you're wrong. You know what I mean? I'd rather, and then that's kind of like the idea of like limit testing, where like, I'm going to do this not because I think it's necessarily going to win me the game, but because, maybe it's better, right? And I only have like 3 or 4 games to figure out, if this is going to be good.
Yeah, exactly. So I can see right away, so that when I do go to play the tournament, I have this like wider array of scenarios I've run into through my few games, so I'm better equipped to handle whatever comes up.
Yeah, just because you don't have the you get to play 1,000 games and just like have this situation come up like naturally or something like that. Yeah,
you have to force situations to occur in the few games you are playing.
Right, and then from that information, you kind of infer, about other situations that might not, come up. Like it's some weird like superposition between this situation you've created and some situation that you would normally see, right? And like it's kind of like augments your training data, I guess is the way you can put it.
Wow, spoken like a real data scientist.
There it is. Yeah.
This is really how Hamsley thinks of himself as a neural network.
Yeah.
All right. So what is phase 1 of training the Hamsley net?
All right. So the first thing you got to do is you need to just get yourself acquainted with the format. Just have a general overview, go to something like MTG Goldfish, maybe somebody has like a primer for the, primers usually come with like limited sets, right? But a lot of this is like pretty interchangeable between like limited and constructed. But just figure out a way to kind of get an overview of the format. Be aware of like the top decks, be aware of like the more overpowered mechanics if you're doing like limited or whatever. Just kind of get a general feel for how, the direction of the format is currently compared to maybe the last time you played it, and then just understand how the top decks are built and how they're winning and why people are playing these over something else, why certain things are popular now and why certain things have fallen out of favor. Just kind of paint a picture of what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Just get a sense of how prevalent each deck is and key interactions, what each deck is trying to do. Like some examples you give here is like Uro plus Cryptic, like Cryptic Command and Sanctuary, how that lock works. Like when you're looking at deck lists, you should identify what that deck's trying to do. In Standard, if you're looking at adventure deck lists, you should know that they're going to be trying to getting advantage off of Edgewall Innkeeper. And that can also inform why there are inclusions in other decks there to answer that. Just from this skimming deck list point, you should be able to get kind of a skeleton of how games are played between each archetype you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. And then you kind of want to think about how these kind of decks play out. So like pick two of the top performing meta decks and look at the deck list and say, okay, well, if this deck executes its plan reasonably well and this deck executes its plan reasonably well, how is that matchup going to go? Who's favored? What needs to happen for deck A to win? What needs to happen for deck B to win? That sort of thing. It just reminds me a lot of, at some point somebody asked Sean McLaren, how much testing he does. And he said something like, he doesn't test all that much. He just thinks about how the matchups go and he just kind of theory crafts it in his head. And
I mean, to some extent, relying on actual data and testing is sort of the lazy way out. Like, I'm actually maybe bad for this. I kind of thought it was a good habit, but now that you're pointing it out, maybe it's not. But if people ask, how do you think this deck will do when they're showing me some brew? I'll be like, maybe I'd change these cards, but I'd have to play it to find out. Which is really a lazy way of just saying, I don't want to think through how this deck goes.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, a lot of times too, you're there's a lot of bias in MTG decks that when somebody gives me a win rate, it's okay, but who did you play it against? What decks were they playing? If you play this deck 100 times, if you played every deck, 10 times and you played it against a variety of skill level opponents, there's a lot of noise kind of inherent in there. And I think there's a lot of merit to just kind of sit and think about how these two decks kind of should fight. And of course, you can then test that, you know what I mean? See if you're correct. But I think it's really important to kind of go with some prior understanding of how the matchups all should go. And, there's a lot of value to be thinking about that as opposed to actually needing to sit down and grind to figure that out.
I mean, well, yeah, really, you're just describing the scientific method, right? Sure, you can just go collect data and then be like, oh, that's weird. What's going on here? Or you could think about it a bit and then your data collection is a bit more targeted.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is just data science. Now, the more I'm talking about it, you're right. It's just data science leaking into MTG. I'm just in my head, you need strong inductive priors and you need priors that make sense.
Well, I mean, I think this is reasonable, right? If you're going to approach this hobby seriously, we have thousands of years of people working on what's the most efficient way to gather information. And it turns out that also applies to other scenarios.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, so that's step one is kind of get your bearings. What's changed from the format since the last time you played it? What's new? What's, kind of fallen out of favor? How are people building decks? Why are they making the decisions they're doing? Just broad level overview stuff.
This is something I did not do the first time I ever played Modern at GP Toronto way back in 2012. Zero practice going in. Didn't even know what any of the decks in the format were aside from Tron, the one I played. Got paired against Jund 9 times, crushed it. I was like, this deck's so bad. Why are so many people playing this deck? Can't beat me ever. Play against Malyrapod in round 6. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Smash them anyway. Go to my friends after. I'm like, guys, I saw these cards. I don't know what this deck does. Please tell me what's happening.
That was, my friend Gavin, ex-roommate actually, he was kind of a giant troll. My first time ever playing Modern. I've been playing Magic for 6 months. Don't know what anything does. He just gives me pod and he says, you'll figure it out.
Yeah. That happened to our friend Ron too. Someone lent him a deck and he was playing some tournament and he was 3-1 with it. And at one point he went and asked someone, he's like, why is this bad card in my deck? I keep just not casting it because it seems bad and I'm winning with my other creatures. Just not knowing that he could combo off was just attacking.
So that was that was me. I couldn't figure out why they had oh
Well, that
crap,
was you.
what's it called? Oh, maybe it was me. What crap? What's the? I know what it does. I'm so bad at this. I know what all the cards do, but I never know what Spike Feeder. I didn't know what Spike Feeder was doing in my deck because I just didn't understand it combo with Archangel. There's too much text. I just didn't read it.
Oh, that's so good.
Okay, yeah. So let's say you have this, unlike these funny stories here, you have this overarching kind of theoretical understanding of the format. Your phase 2 is actually a step that I wouldn't have thought would be included. My instinct is to just pick a deck you want to play now from this and start playing it. But your phase 2 is to take an archetype you know, not necessarily one that you want to even play, just something that you're familiar with, and play that through some leagues.
Yeah, so I mean, this is maybe even an optional phase if you really are low on time, I guess. But like, I like to kind of check my understanding. I'm like really bad at this. Even when I'm like coding or something like this, every line I write, I like confirm almost that it's doing what I think it's doing, mostly out of paranoia. But I want to make sure that like, the way I think the meta is more or less how it is, and I'm not like critically misunderstanding something. So I like to do a little bit of a practice with the deck that I'm quite familiar with. And making sure that matchups kind of go as expected, and making sure the decks that I think are fighting for objective A are actually like going to work towards that and aren't just doing something weird and strange to me.
Yeah, and the point being here is that if you're trying to do this step with a deck that you just picked up, for instance, you might be playing the deck you just picked up wrong, in which case it's not super important what your opponent's doing, and so they might be able to win while doing weird things, and it doesn't give you a good check on your understanding from part 1.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, let's say I want to get into Modern, and I'm like looking at this Hammer deck, and I think, hey, this Hammer deck, with Colossus Hammer plus like Sigarda's Aid, it probably has a really good, place in the meta right now, but I've never played it before. Maybe it makes sense to like, pick a deck, that I've played before, and making sure that I'm evaluating the meta correctly before trying to do kind of 2 steps at once, which is evaluate the meta, confirm my understanding of the meta, and learn a new deck at the same time. Because,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now you've got 2 unknown variables when you could just have 1.
Yeah. So we've thought through the meta. We've checked the meta with a deck we know, if there is one, hopefully. Now we get to what I would have done next, which is identify an archetype you think is good or that you want to play, and now actually play it. And here again, you emphasize that because you have limited time to play, your play should be a bit more experimental. You should be trying to maybe take weird lines to see how they go, because you're really trying to learn this deck as fast as possible, which is really, expose yourself to as much as it can do as possible.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of this, by the way, is me kind of leveraging the fact that I've played a bunch of Magic, right? This maybe isn't so effective for like a newer player who needs just like reps to like learn kind of the fundamentals of the game, I guess. But if you've been, and been around the block a little bit, you can kind of draw on that experience, right? And so you don't need to go through the ABCs necessarily. You can kind of skip ahead to the back of the book a few chapters and just say, okay, well, what if I do this? What if I do that? Is this, and the idea of like limit testing here comes in as well.
I guess you could summarize the advice here as like, play lines that you need to learn what happens. And if you're a newer player, that's just the usual gameplay. Like, how does this game usually win? How does it deal with its opponent's usual threats? Whereas if you feel you have a handle on that, either from prior experience or you've already played some games, then, a game where you think there's some line that can probably win, but you're undecided between it and another, like take the other and see what happens. Like, you should just be pushing at the limit of how you understand your deck functions.
Yeah, exactly. Like if there's a decision that you don't know, or if there's information you don't know, you should try to acquire it, basically, rather than going through a line that you think is like probably pretty good, versus a line that you really have no idea. Take the line that you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, you're not going to do this in a tournament.
Right. This is purely
information gathering. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then with this, once you've tested a bunch of these lines and cases and you've got some reps in to gain some understanding of the deck you've chosen, you then look for improvements.
Yeah, for sure. So now we've chosen our archetype. We've kind of gone through this. We're getting our bearings, getting our wits about us, and then you kind of think more specifically about the matchups, right? So this is one of the advice pieces of advice you get when you're playing like League or something like this, or a lot of other games like StarCraft or whatever, is don't learn all of the different races in StarCraft. Learn one, so then you only have to worry about 3 matchups. Don't play random if you're trying to improve, because then you have to worry about 9 matchups, right? Only learn a couple champions at League, so you only have to worry about all of their matchups versus like your 1 or 2 champions, right? So we've kind of so hammering down an archetype that you think is good early for that reason is like usually pretty important, because now you can think about, okay, how does this deck so for the DWC tournament I picked red. Okay, how does red beat Gruul? What cards matter, for example? Okay, well, Skoos and Lovestruck matter, I think, a lot in that particular deck. Also, like the Great Henge, right? Things like Bushfire and Innkeeper, they don't matter as much, right? If we were playing a control deck, Bushfire and Innkeeper matter quite a bit more than Skoos and Lovestruck, right? So think about what specific cards can you beat and what is going to matter in the game, right? Like what needs to go right for you to win, what needs to go wrong for you to lose, that sort of question.
Yeah, and this is, of course, informed by the experimenting and the weird lines you took. Maybe you played some games against Gruul as red, and you had some games where you tried to kill Lovestruck, you had some games where you tried to kill Brushfire, you had some games where you tried to ignore Lovestruck, and like no matter, in all of those, Lovestruck was an issue. So now you've kind of identified, all right, is there something I can do about this?
Yeah, exactly, right? So maybe you have like 2 of the bolts in your hand, the Frostbites, and you're like, well, I'll double Frostbite a Lovestruck. How did that play out for you versus ignoring the Lovestruck, right? Something like this, right? And that's how you kind of, and you can kind of use what happened in those, even if they're just instances. Humans are pretty good at generalizing from like small sample sizes, at least in some contexts. and here we're kind of forcing ourselves to generalize from small sample sizes, right? So we're kind of taking that information that we've learned and kind of thinking about that in the greater context of like all the possibilities of how the matchups could go without actually having to play them. Right? So you can ask questions about, if you've identified Lovestruck as like the issue, do we need to kill it? If we need to kill it and we can't win with that card on the field, okay, maybe it's worth playing Soulseer, right? Or a Crow in War, something like this, right? If we can ignore it with Cleave, do we just not play Soulseer because 3-mana removal spell isn't what our deck that's trying to smork wants to do? Do we have to go at the air? Is the Phoenix a good enough card? Because it's evasive, but it only attacks for 2. Is that relevant? Stuff like this. So you have very specific questions about the matchups based around what you think is going to give you trouble, right? You don't need to think about whether or not you're going to bolt a Brushfire Elemental, because spoilers, you don't need to unless it's turning on the Lovestruck Beast, in which case, yeah, maybe. But you know what I mean. So you identify what matters and you think about sideboard cards and main deck choices, and then even just like overall game decisions based around what matters.
Yeah, really this phase is just tuning the deck you've chosen for the meta you think is going to show up, but in a very narrow context of tuning the deck I've chosen to better adapt to like some of the stuff I've noticed in my testing games so that I understand why I've made these choices during the tournament.
Right, exactly. And also even you can go as far as say tuning your decision-making process and like making sure that you understand what decisions you need to make like in-game as well as deck building.
Yeah, as well. And of course, as a last step, after all of this, the ultimate sanity check, you can just chat with other people. Like a lot of people play mono red and they've done all this.
So the thing to keep in mind is you shouldn't just necessarily default to what other people say if it conflicts with your experience, but it's definitely important to talk to other people and figure what they think about the matchups. And the key in this kind of step, as well as in the other steps, I didn't really, we didn't talk about it necessarily, but you really want to focus on discrepancies. If you think a matchup's going to go one way and it goes completely the other way, you really need to hammer out why that happened, right? It's not interesting if you tell me that, I don't know, what's like a famous, like, like Tron beats Jund, okay, that's true. We don't need to test it, right?
Yeah.
No point, right? But if there's some, deck you think that you have a really good matchup and it turns out you lose 5 games in a row, you really got to figure out why that is and what's going wrong and why did your expectations get, why were you wrong?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it's
so
much much quicker to figure out why your assumptions and expectations were wrong if you can immediately get someone else to share their perspective on the matchup rather than you have to come up with a whole new theory to counter your first one, which is hard to do even in the best of times.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing is, well, I mean, that's absolutely correct. But also, just like if you think a matchup's really bad, but somebody else thinks a matchup's really good, but the other way too, or if you think a matchup's really good and somebody else says I can't win, and you go, why can't you win? And then they, you either watch them play or they take you through some of the decisions they made during the game, and you go, oh, well, I wouldn't have done that. So this decision that I thought was like either obvious or like maybe not even realizing how important it was, maybe it's more significant than you thought. So really focusing on like discrepancies and just saying like, there's not much point in, discussing whether or not a deck is
Yeah.
I
mean, that's even what we did today, right? Like when Stelly and I are doing coverage and someone mulligans and we both immediately suggest the same card for them to put back, I forget that example. I don't even remember what the hand was. But when there's disagreement, I remember exactly those 7 cards, and I remember why I thought which one I should put back because Stelly disagreed with me. And then we brought it up on the show again, and we talked about it more.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I think we came to the right decision overall.
Yeah, and it ended up being a third thing that none of us had thought of.
Shocker.
This is how we grow and learn together.
Yep. And it's also important because the person who I first showed the hand to was a guy named Josh Malloy, who is an extremely good Magic player, and he said charge her back immediately. So, make sure you're friends with people who are smarter than you.
That's been my strategy for most of my life, boys.
Huge shout outs to Josh. We've been because I think his philosophy is kind of the same, as we don't really have time nor the desire to like be grinding games. So we've kind of become testing partners in the sense that we'll bounce ideas and share lists and making sure that we're on the same page. And if we're not, figuring out why it is that we're not. So like making sure I have it in the notes, utilize the quote unquote gathering, because anybody can be a magician, but not everybody has the social circle of people that they can talk to improve. So yeah.
Speaking of that, if you want to get a social circle where you can discuss these sort of things with multiple players, consider joining our Patreon. For the lowest tier, you can get access to the full DWC Discord, where many like-minded players who jam MTG all the time will happily share their opinions with you if you ever have questions like this.
Yeah, that's a good resource.
Nailed it.
Use it.
Yep,
it's perfect.
And your last point here, Hemsley, just play some warm-up games before the event. The first game I play of the day, it's bad.
Yeah,
I typically
don't like to go into events. Even if it's just a couple, right? You don't have to play like an entire, league or I guess 5 matches on arena or whatever it is, right? But like, get your coffee, get a couple games going, and then just makes. I mean, that's less of a training on short amount of time, but more about how I've been successful recently is that I've taken that more seriously and making sure that I don't just like play the first.
I think this is also particularly important when you've trained on a short amount of time, because there's so much information you're drawing from this small sample set, this small prep time, that expecting yourself to just remember it all immediately off the first game is kind of unrealistic, whereas playing 1 or 2 games will jog your memory for what you did do in testing so that you kind of all have it at the forefront of your mind when you do start playing. It's like the test strategy of if you've crammed right before a test, before you even look at the questions, just quickly write down everything you've just memorized.
Yeah, I've done that before.
And then write the test. Don't just go into the first question expecting to hope to remember everything you've crammed, because you'll remember what's relevant to the first question, and by the second you'll have forgotten some part of it.
Yeah, that's just a huge strategy for running exams in university. It's like literally reading the textbook when they said put everything away, and then just like muttering to yourself under your breath.
Yeah, repeating the like 3 sentences that you're going to write down to remember, and then
All right. Well, on that note, that's going to wrap things up for us today. Matt, thanks for joining the show. It was a pleasure to have you on, as always.
Oh, thank you.
Congrats again on your second place finish at the biggest event of 2021 so far.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, got to shout out our sponsor, Wizard Tower, for sponsoring the DWC Organizational as well as sponsoring the podcast. Check them out, wizardtower.com, for all your Magic single needs. And you can actually head to their website, wizardtower.com/we're-moving, to check out all their information about their new location here in Ottawa. So if you're local to the area, you can go see their brand new store soon, I expect. It looks like they've been getting a lot of work done at the spot recently based on the photos they've been posting. And if you want to find more content from the DWC, head over to our website, dwc.gg. Got links to our Twitch page, our MTG Amelia events, our Patreon, our YouTube channel. Great one-stop shop for everything DWC. And however you listen to the show, whether it's Podbean, iTunes, any podcast app, leave a review, rate the podcast, share it with your friends. Everything helps, keeps the show growing, bring it to new listeners. Thanks for listening. Catch you all next week.
See you.